A lot of familiar faces. For those who don't know me, I'm Richard Callaghan, I'm the library director here in Bedford. And we want to welcome all of you to our winter lecture series every year since 2006, I think.
That's right.
So, which is of course sponsored by the Friends of the Library, through all their hard work, book sales, and raising funds for the library. We put on programs like this, which is great. And we also provide the brownies. Which everybody loves. Just a couple things before I turn over to Dan. Series dates, we are the usual schedule, Sundays, 2 o'clock. Until March 2nd. The only Sunday we'll not be meeting is President's Day weekend.
Right.
Otherwise, a long weekend, but it'll be every Sunday until March 2nd. It's a five-section program. I want to thank all our patrons of the library for bearing with us during our HVAC project. We are getting done, but it'll probably be finished by May, we think. They still have to bring a crane in and put the AC, which is right above us, take that one out, put the new one on. So they've been working steadily. They're working so well that we're now working in my office, so I don't have an office. The next like two to 3 weeks, hopefully 2 weeks. So I'm doing a lot of work from home, but I will be around if anybody needs me. And just for those people who are wanting to get into this door over here, I know it's a little closer, and especially we want to accommodate everyone. That door's a little wonky on locking, so we try not to open it. We're trying to get it fixed. This door, however, is fine. So if people want to come in and they don't want to go through the whole library, they're more than welcome to come knock on this door, and we'll let you in, just in case next week. Hopefully next week people have less ice, less cold, maybe ice, maybe. But I think that's about it, except for our introduction of. If I know a lot of you know Dan Breen from Brandeis University. Dan has, like I said, has been lecturing with us since 2006 on a wide variety of subjects. Yes, we go to our website, all the subjects are listed on the posts that we have up there. So Dan is you have a PhD and now you're in legal studies, Brandon.
Yes, that's right.
And so he has been our favorite lecturer for a number of years. So we're very, very happy to have him back. And I hope you continue even after I'm not here next year. So
I hope so.
I will leave. I've been asked this by a couple of patrons. I will leave a note for my successor to say, this is something we do every year. That's how you contact Dan. And so I'll make sure that happens. Otherwise, I think we can turn it over to Dan.
We can begin.
Yeah.
Okay, everybody. We're going to close the seat wall. Once more, the topic for this lecture series is going to be the public monuments of Boston. And of course, that is a basic topic that everybody is worried about today, not just when it comes to the monuments of Boston, but the entire topic of who we commemorate, how we decide who we commemorate, and what happens when we don't want to commemorate the people that we used to want to commemorate. What happens to those statues? So I thought this might be a good way to contribute to that overall national discussion with some attention to the situation here in Boston and some stories behind the statues that have, in many cases, graced our civic landscape and in some cases up to faced our city landscape for almost 200 years in some cases. And I thought it might be a good idea to begin at the beginning of the whole project of commemorating important, illustrious figures in North America. And that story actually occurs in a setting a little bit away from Boston, but I think it helps illustrate a theme we'll come back to in this particular lecture, as we'll see eventually regarding Boston. And that is that when it comes to deciding who we want to commemorate and build a statue for, sometimes it's a good idea to wait a while before we make that decision. So, as a case in point, let's begin here. Hopefully this will work. Well, it's not working.
Oh, that's weird.
Well, we have.
It was working.
Plan B.
It was
Let's try this. No.
Plug it back in.
All right. Well,
No,
this could complicate things. It looks like the power's on. Oh, there it is.
That might have been me.
Yeah, I think it's working.
I just rebooted it. Yeah, I just no, you did it. You did it. So you can see
Let's begin with this statue here. A lot of you will recognize this, talking about maybe making a hasty decision. Back when the Stamp Act was repealed after 1765, the people of New York were so grateful to George III that they decided they wanted to erect a statue of him in Bowling Green Park, which is still there, the lower tip of Manhattan. And this is the statue they got of a mounted George III, not only one of the very first statues in North America, but also the most unhealthy statue in North America, because this thing consists of 2 tons of lead. Just a little bit of gold gilt on top, but it's really 2 tons of lead. And we know what happened to this statue. It went up in 1770. There was a big public celebration of it, but that was 1770. 1776 was a bit of a different story. And 5 days after the Declaration of Independence was read in the streets of New York, a crowd emerged in front of Bowling Green. They got through the iron gate around it, which is still there, that iron gate, and they pulled this statue down. And what they decided to do with it was make bullets out of it, because of course this is a lead statue. They hauled it off to Connecticut, and they made 42,000 bullets out of this statue for the Continental Army. But they didn't make bullets out of the entire thing. Bits and pieces of it didn't actually get to the foundry, and they were preserved in some cases by loyalists who didn't like the whole idea. And that's one thing that was never made into bullets. That's the horse's tail from the statue. That's all that's left of it, except for a few minor bits and pieces. And you can go to the New York Historical Society today. You can see the tail. So it's right there on display for anybody who wants to go see it. But that was 1776, and it illustrates a phenomenon that is as old as the country itself. That is, sometimes we change our minds about who we want to commemorate. And then the thing to do is decide, what do we do when we change our minds? Do we leave it there as an artistic testament? Do we put some kind of a plaque there to show that there's now a controversy about it? Or do we take the thing down? So these questions are not new. It was resolved that way in 1776. And we're just thinking about that and resolving it in different ways today throughout the United States, of course, but especially in the old Confederacy. Now, leaving the story of the 18th century to the 18th century, now let's move on a little bit into the 19th century. And it will surprise nobody that in the early days of the Republic, when it came to figures that Americans might want to erect statues of, in a republic where there were literally no outdoor statues outside of a couple cities on the East Coast, the figure who came to mind, first of all, was of course George Washington. And there began to be committees here and there to raise money to erect statues of George Washington. And Boston was no exception. We were one of the first towns, when we were still a town in 1811, to decide we needed a statue of George Washington. And what happened in Boston was the way statues tend to go up, and tended to go up for most of our history. A few leading citizens got together in 1811, people with money and influence, many of whom resided back then on Beacon Hill or by what is now Downtown Crossing. And these wealthy Bostonians decided to raise money for a Washington statue. They didn't know quite where they were going to put it yet. And they certainly didn't know who the sculptor was going to be, because there were literally no full-time sculptors in the United States in 1811. But they at least took the idea, they began raising money, and then after the War of 1812, they found the sculptor willing to do the job. And it was a fortunate choice. He happened to be an English sculptor living across the ocean, a guy named Francis Chantry, who has to me an interesting story. He grew up very poor in the Midlands, Francis Chantry did. He was a donkey drover, and then he was an apprentice to a grocer. Nobody would ever think he'd be an artist until he began fiddling around with whittling wood in his spare time. And one day somebody was visiting the grocery store, saw him whittling in wood, looked at what he was doing, and this guy said, "Oh, that's Old Fox the schoolmaster." And in fact, it was Old Fox the schoolmaster. That's who Chantry had been whittling. And then Chantry said to himself, maybe I'm good at this. Maybe this is the way to earn a living. He was almost completely self-taught. He went and he observed a few sculptors at work, and that was enough for him, and he became a really good working sculptor by the beginning of the 19th century. He was the sort of person everybody seemed to like. He was an enthusiastic fisherman, a lover of dogs, took a lot of snuff, great in conversation. The only people who maybe didn't like him were the trout, because when he fished them out of the stream, he beat them to death with this ivory ruler that he had. Other than that, he really got along with everybody. And he was actually a very good sculptor. And if you go to London, I know many of you do go to London now and then. If you go to Trafalgar Square, the statue of George IV, the Trafalgar Square, is by Francis Chantry. He emerged as a leading sculptor in England, and he got the commission. It's got to be, I think, $10,000. and he's gonna do a nice marble statue of George Washington. But it was gonna take him a while to do it. He had other commissions in the 18 teens, turn of the 1820s, and Bostonians eagerly awaited the statue that Chantry was going to provide them. But in the meantime, other places got their own Washington statue, and we'd be remiss without mentioning this one. That's the statue of Washington by maybe the premier sculptor in Europe in the early 19th century, Antonio Canova. And that was a commission by the state of North Carolina. Canova was suggested to North Carolina by none other than Thomas Jefferson in the early 1820s. And Canova agreed to do a marble statue for the rotunda of the brand new North Carolina Capitol. And this is what Canova produced. It's, as you see, George Washington in a military Roman uniform, and he's got a stylus, and what he's doing is he's writing the farewell address there on the tablet on your right. It was a very accomplished work. It was shipped across the Atlantic, and they put it in the North Carolina Rotunda. What a wonderful idea. It's little Raleigh, North Carolina, just a little crossroads in the early 1820s. And now they had a sculpture by one of the paramount sculptors in the world for people to come and see and admire. And the idea for Bostonians as well as North Carolinians was you would come see George Washington here in the days when the revolutionary generation was passing away. And anybody who saw Washington would be reminded of the virtues of nobility and self-sacrifice and virtue that Washington exemplified. They'd be inspired by it, and the great revolutionary generation would live on in statuary. It was supposed to inspire people. That was the idea. And North Carolinians thought this succeeded brilliantly, and they wanted to keep it around. And they wanted to keep it around so much that they got really worried in 1831 when there was a big fire in Fayetteville, North Carolina, just down the road from Raleigh. And when news arrived of this fire in Fayetteville that destroyed much of the town, people in Raleigh decided, we got to make sure there's no fire here. And if there is one, we want to make sure it doesn't hurt the Capitol and destroy the statue. So what they wanted to do was fireproof the North Carolina State Capitol building. So what they did was they put on the roof this big zinc layer that was supposed to help preserve the roof. And while the workmen were up there soldering in the rivets to make sure the zinc layer would stay on the roof, the soldering caused a fire, and that burned the roof, and it burned the Capitol, and it destroyed the statue. It's no marble Canova statue, but if you want to see it, there's a plaster version at the North Carolina State Museum. The State Art Museum in Raleigh has the plaster version. So you can still see it, but you can't see the original. Meanwhile, back to Boston, here we were, it's now the 1820s, and we still didn't have any public monuments in the city. Everybody's awaiting the Washington statue. And by now they decided where to put it. The original idea, which I think was not a bad one, was to put it at Quincy Market, which had just been introduced by the great illustrious mayor, Josiah Quincy. What a wonderful place for the Washington statue to be. Everybody would pass by it. Everybody would be inspired by it. But a lot of these merchants thought it would be not such a good idea if Washington was covered with a bunch of used oyster remnants and bits of vegetables here and there. And they didn't like the idea of the founder of the country at Quincy Market. So they decided on the next best thing. Let's put it inside. Let's put it in the State House, the Bullfinch State House. And let's create an entire new room for it, which became Doric Hall, which is still there to this day. And everybody was excited to see what Chantry came up with. And this is what he came up with. This is the Washington statue by Francis Chantry, $10,000 worth of it, which you can still see in Doric Hall to this day. And it arrived at the time to general acclaim in 1827. And I want to read you a newspaper editorial, actually a poem about it, that was published in the Daily Advertiser the week that this arrived and was unveiled in Doric Hall. And this expresses what the statue is meant to do: inspire people, make people want to be like Washington, thus preserving the Republic in America for time immemorial. So here's what the poem said: there's awe in thy main form. Come hither then, ye that o'erthrong the land, and ye shall know what greatness is. Come, look on him. Would ye indeed be men? That was the idea. A lot of people liked it. I like it. There's a certain nobility, a certain, I think, grace and dignity to the figure. I think it is inspiring in its way, but not everybody liked it. And you may be able to see why, because Washington was an 18th century figure, And to many practical Bostonians, an 18th century figure, George Washington, had no business wearing a toga. What on earth is he doing wearing a toga? A Roman gown, as some people called it. And one of the premier early art critics in America, none other than Davy Crockett, who's right there. Oops.
Wow.
There's Davy Crockett. Davy Crockett went to see the Chantry statue, and he delivered his own verdict, 3 words, "It ain't right." It ain't right, because of this toga. Well, Chantry was really bothered by these criticisms, as were others, and Chantry tried to defend himself on charges that he had essentially falsified the real Washington by putting this classical toga on him. And what Chantry said, and what Chantry's defender said was, "That's not a toga. This is a tribute to Washington's service at Valley Forge. This is a military blanket." No, it isn't. Who wears a blanket like that? That's not a military blanket. That's a toga. Chantry was a bit of Phil Blarney here, I would think. But that's how they defended themselves. Now, to me, I think it still works on an important level. If you want to display some classical values of nobility and virtue and self-sacrifice, maybe a toga isn't such a bad thing. And he doesn't go too far towards the classicizing and the idealizing here. It's still recognizably Washington, and he's still, if you look up to the top of the statue, still an 18th century dress up there. But nonetheless, it did cause some critical comment at the time, so statue controversies are nothing new. But Washington is still there in door call. There he is at the very end of it. Door call looks different today. It was a bit more splendid in the early days, but people did go to see it quite often. It made mostly a favorable impression, and it got other Bostonians to think maybe we need other statues because this one seems to have, in general, done its work. We want to remind people of the greatness of Washington and inspire them as the generations go on. Davy Crockett notwithstanding. This would become a well-known statue. For many years was considered the finest statue by some critics in America, despite the toga. And when the Union was falling apart in 1861, in the weeks before Fort Sumter, it was this statue that Harper's Weekly decided to depict on an issue that, for many people, in the early part of 1861, might be one of the last issues with a Union that had not yet been severed, here in the weeks before Fort Sumter. So they're commemorating Washington's birthday in February of 1861. Harper's Weekly gives us the statue of George Washington, maybe a last-ditch pictorial effort to get people to think nationally instead of locally and regionally. But of course, maybe the effort is doomed, as you can probably tell. Unlike in the actual statue, Washington is frowning here. In other words, maybe the effort is not going to work. Well, that was Washington's entry into the scene of Boston, the very first portrait statue in Boston, Chantry's Washington. And there would not be another for a very long time, actually for another 22, 23 years. Anybody know what the next statues in Boston were? 1827 was Chantry. We would have to wait till the end of the 1840s for the next ones. And therein lies the story that I'll get to after this one. So this is the most notorious of all the American Washington statues. Boston now had a statue by Chantry to our general acclaim. So Congress, in 1832, to commemorate Washington's 200th anniversary of his birth, decided maybe the national capital needed a George Washington statue. They had one in North Carolina. Now they had one in Boston. Why not Washington, D.C.? And so they sought out for a sculptor to deliver a new statue of Washington for the nation's capital. And the choice settled on one of the more famous sculptors who were beginning to come out of the United States, Horatio Greno of Jamaica Plain, who was then living and studying in Italy. They gave him the commission. And I think you can tell from this result that Greno, unlike Chantry, a good practical-minded Englishman, was very heavily influenced, and maybe too much, by the classicizing or neoclassical sense prevalent in Italy, that what a sculpture ought to do was not depict the person, but rather depict, instead of anything else, the higher, loftier virtues associated with the person. So Greno went to work on his Washington statue. It took him a while. It took him many years, as a matter of fact, but he finally produced this. This thing is 12 tons of marble. This thing took 12 oxen to ship from Rome to the coast so that there'd be a ship big enough to take it ultimately to the United States. Here we see Greenough depicting George Washington in the manner not of what you might associate with an 18th century figure, which he was, but rather with Zeus. This is his model, the famous statue of Zeus by Phidias from the Athenian Greek tradition. And so this is what he gives us. I'll just describe a little of this statue so you can see perhaps what some of the problems might be with it. It's not just Washington pointing up, I guess because heavens are inspiring him. Maybe that makes some sense. But what makes little sense to me are the carvings around the curio. Well, first of all, that's a problem. What is he doing sitting on this chair? This is a Roman curio. He wouldn't be sitting in a curio because he wasn't a Roman. He was a Virginian. Well, first of all, that's a Roman chair, which was going to create some critical comment. The other thing is he's bare-chested. Anybody who knew Washington knew he would never appear in public that way, because it's a classicizing ideal. It's not really George Washington. But then, what about this? If you look around the base of the chair, the curio, what you will find, for example, is Hercules battling a serpent. Well, Iphiclus, and none of you will need to be told that Iphiclus was the brother of Ortholocus. Iphiclus was cowering in dread, and that's Greno's way of depicting South America, Iphiclus, lacking the fortitude to follow the freedom-loving example of North America, Hercules. Okay. No, nobody would get that, but that was around the chair. And then there's Columbus. Columbus was there somewhere, keeping company with an Indian chief. There's a special statue of the Indian chief there. There's a Latin inscription on the back. And this entire thing was put together after years, based upon Greek models. It's sent over to the United States. It got there in one piece. Yeah, the sword is sheathed. That's the symbol of Washington giving up his generalship in order to go back to civilian life after the revolution. And if Greenough thought this would inspire people and make them want to be like Washington, he was sadly mistaken. It got to Washington and it invited general ridicule. They tried to put it in the rotunda, but then they got afraid that the thing was so heavy the floor would give in. So what they did was they took it out of the rotunda, and as you see here, they put it outside on the Capitol grounds, where it would be for almost a century, as a matter of fact. And people kept making fun of this thing, unfortunately. A Whig congressman from South Carolina thought it was the most horrid phantasmagoria I have ever beheld. Congressman Wise of Virginia, when it arrived, thought that the head should be kept and the rest tossed into the Potomac. Numerous commentators thought that Washington looked as if he were in a Turkish bath, signaling either for a towel or for more hot water. Rather than standing before this Washington and being filled with inspiration, I want to be just like that. Kids would throw pebbles at him. Somebody stole one of his toes. Indignity after indignity. Hardly anybody liked it. The way I would put it is, a wonder of the ancient world had turned into a blunder in Washington. And eventually this thing was put inside where you can see it now at the Smithsonian Museum of American History. Probably a lot of you have seen it there. So it's still there, but it's not on public display. So here's an example of what you might want to avoid in Republican democratizing America. What Greenough didn't understand, this neoclassical sculptor imbued with the ideals of ancient Greece and Rome, was that sometimes those ideals in the American context, if you take them too far, in an increasing spreading democracy, simply invite people to make fun of them. They become pompous rather than inspiring. Now, I think Chantry didn't go so far. I think that was okay. This one, though, did go a little bit too far. And it's a good example of what to avoid. Would that lesson be learned in Boston? Well, it's going to take a while to figure that out, because this went up eventually in the early 1840s. And by then, Boston still didn't have any more statues. It was just Chantry in the door call at the State House. But eventually we did get a couple more statues, and they're still there to this day. I'll bet all of you have seen them, and you may not know that they are the very first outdoor statues in Boston to depict real people. And here's one of them. Aristides the Just. And And you're all saying, well, of course. Aristides the Just is in Louisburg Square. And Aristides the Just has been in Louisburg Square ever since 1849. Now, the story of how Aristides the Just got in Boston, that is Louisburg Square, is told in several different versions. I'm not sure there's an authoritative one, but the best version that I subscribe to has to do with a man who was serving as the consul to Boston from the Ottoman Empire in the 1840s, and his name was Joseph Yasinji, who had an awful lot of money and a very active trade between Boston and what is now Turkey, Anatolia, that part of the Ottoman Empire. And in 1849, in one ship that went over to Izmir, the Osmanli, and they took a bunch of stuff from New England, and they took a bunch of stuff back, but they needed ballast. And so Yasinji's agents took this statue on as ballast, as well as another statue. And the idea was maybe the ballast, so that we don't get sunk, will also be good because it'll get back to Boston. Maybe somebody will actually buy this stuff. So Yasinji took Aristides the Just in the other statue, and he put them for sale at Central Wharf at his store. Nobody wanted it. And now it's late 1849. But remember, he was living at 3 Louisburg Square. So he figured maybe we should put it in Louisburg Square. There's this nice park there that we all maintain. So they had a big meeting at Louisburg Square. And the idea was, okay, we'll take Aristides the Just. Oh, what a great idea. Aristides the Just in Louisburg Square. But we got to throw in the other statue, and that was Columbus. So Aristides the Just is on one side of Louisburg Square, and Columbus is on the other side of Louisburg Square. Well, of course, Aristides the Just, anybody passing by Aristides the Just would say to themselves exactly what anybody would think of, which is, oh, it's too bad that he didn't have his way when he was advising against Themistocles' strategy against the Persians. The only significant thing about Aristides is, first of all, it's kind of nice to look at. But the other thing about this little statue is that MIT used to have a clubhouse at 6 Louisburg Square, and they loved this statue, those MIT kids. All through the late 19th century, they would dig it up where they needed to, and they'd take it in for ceremonies, and they'd dress him up. If it was graduation, they put a cap and gown on him, and they'd always take him back. And for Columbus, actually the Italian community of Boston used to have a wreath-laying ceremony because that was the only Columbus statue in Boston for a while in the early to mid 19th century, even towards the late 19th century. So they've had an active life in Louisburg Square. The people who live at Louisburg Square seem to like these statues. They are charming in their way, not good art, but they are charming. I'm not sure they have anything to do with Boston. But one thing that's significant about these very first outdoor portrait statues in Boston's history. One thing that's significant about them is they are to this day the only residents of Louisburg Square who don't go to Martha's Vineyard in August. So Columbus he went into 1850, and Aristides the Just went in 1849, and then now we got 2 statues, but we don't have another one until the main topic for today, and this is what I'll talk about for the rest of the period. The third statue that was actually contemplated or planned for Boston, actually 4th, Washington, Aristides the Just in Columbus. And as we'll see, that's going to be the statue of Daniel Webster. Now this would be a good time for me to let you know that I don't mind if you want to get up and get brownies and coffee. We're now at the halfway point, so this may be a good time to pause for a second. Does anybody have any comments or questions so far?
Well, great.
Well, let's go. So this story is a contentious one, a controversial one, the story of the Daniel Webster statue. And the reason that's controversial is because it illustrates that concept that I brought up at the very beginning. Sometimes it's a good idea to wait a while before you decide who to commemorate. Aristides the Just, that's not that bad. They waited 2,500 years. And then they decided maybe Aristides the Just would be nice to have in Louisburg Square. But the next story is very different. By the way, this is the next Columbus statue to go up in the Boston area. Look at that thing. That thing is the copy of a statue that a group of Catholics wanted to put up in the Dominican Republic to commemorate the 400th anniversary of Columbus's landings in the New World. And what that community wanted to do in Boston was to put that in Copley Square. And that would have been a terrible tragedy. That is an awful monument. Look how out of whack the figure is with the pedestal and the base. It's completely out of proportion. There's very little artistic sensitivity at all, I think, in this work. But it almost went into Copley Square. It would have gone to Copley Square so that anybody going to bask in the majesty of Trinity Church and then turn around and bask in the majesty of the BPL would be faced with that. And it's a really good thing that didn't happen. The reason that didn't happen was the Boston Art Commission had just been formed, and their first major decision was, we're not gonna have anything to do with that. That's not gonna go anywhere, as far as we're concerned. So guess who had to take it? The Boston Archdiocese took it, and they put it up at their Church of the Holy Cross in the South End. And it was there for many decades until they moved it away. You can still go see it today. Go up Route 1 a ways. It's, I think, at the Church of St. Anthony in Revere. So it's still there. It's still up in Revere. But luckily, it's not in Copley Square. Now, here's the story. Daniel Webster finally passed away after a long life in 1852. He died in October of 1852. And at the time, as almost all Americans knew, hardly anybody had a resume to match Daniel Webster. There's no doubt that he was an influential person, very important person in the United States. He'd been a congressman for many years, U.S. Senator for Massachusetts for many years. He had been Secretary of State under John Tyler. He had negotiated the vastly important Webster-Ashburton Treaty that finally settled the Maine boundary to the satisfaction of most parties concerned. He was somebody who was extremely well regarded by the Boston mercantile community. He had represented banking interests all his life, and his great values, the things he stood for, the things he staked his public reputation on, were nationalism, harmony between the sections, peace and quiet, stability, orderly development. He had been a strong voice for all those virtues, especially in his famous fight for the National Bank back in the 1830s. He was somebody who'd been bankrolled by the Boston mercantile community and was immensely respected by them. And when he died in 1852, that community, bankers, the Brahmins, who especially were engaged in trade, in factory interests, were deeply conscious that they had lost somebody deeply important to them, whom they could always count on. His last words were, rather ironically, "I am still alive." Or, "I still live." And what many of them hoped was maybe there was a way he could still be alive. What better way to commemorate Webster and perpetuate him in his ideals of stability and order than perhaps to have a statue to him? But the problem in 1852 was only one half, if that, of the Boston community, the well-heeled part of the Boston community, probably felt that way. Other Bostonians felt completely different about Webster. Webster was detested by a strong and influential part of the Boston community. Boston abolitionists could never forget the afternoon of March 7th, 1850, when Webster had stood up in the Senate and he had thrown his support behind the contemptible Fugitive Slave Act. For him, the Fugitive Slave Act, part of the Compromise of 1850, was, Webster said, essential to the peace of the country. For without it, Webster believed, without the Fugitive Slave Act, the South would leave in 1850. Then and there, we've got to give them something. And the price of union was the hateful Fugitive Slave Act. No abolitionist would ever forgive Webster for that. Horace Mann, the great educator, said, quote, "The man who could read that act without having blood boil in his veins has a power of refrigeration that would cool the tropics." William Lloyd Garrison said, by virtue of that speech, Webster had become ugly and vulgar in the sight of God. He had become the great slave hunter, the brazen advocate of slave catching. It was an enormous betrayal to abolitionists. The great John Greenleaf Whittier wrote a poem about the 7th of March, when Webster had fallen from grace, given in to his ambition and these lower ideals of stability and order, and forgotten about justice, in morality, in freedom, all things precious to abolitionists. This is what John Greenleaf Whittier said. All else is gone. From those great eyes, the soul has fled. When faith is lost, when honor dies, the man is dead. For abolitionists, Webster had died on March 7th, 1850. The other 2 years, a lingering, sad ghost. The bankers had lost somebody they believed in. The abolitionists had lost somebody they had come to despise. And that raises a question. If you've got a city of Boston divided on who Webster was and how valuable he was, why would you put up a statue of somebody, half the community, the best educated part, the poets, the litterateurs? Why would you put up a statue that they could have nothing to do with and would find hateful? Well, the reason you would do that is because if you're the bankers, you've got the power in the money. And this is somebody you believe has got to be perpetuated in memory so that people will see him and they will be imbued with Webster's ideas, peace and quiet. Put aside the slavery problem. Don't think about it. Let's just go on, make money, develop, the self can take care of itself. If those are your ideas, maybe Webster's image in Boston could keep communicating those ideas, even though Webster himself was under the ground in Marshfield. So talking about a hasty decision, 3 days after Webster died, 3 days after he died, there was a big public meeting at Faneuil Hall called by Webster clone Edward Everett, who you see here, for the purpose of deciding how best to memorialize Daniel Webster. And what Everett wanted from the first was a statue. Let's fund a statue. Let's put it up somewhere in Boston. Edward Everett, a man probably a lot of you have heard of, but he's a fairly well-known figure. Edward Everett, valedictorian at Harvard. Such a hard worker that people called Edward ever at it. He'd known Webster ever since 1813. They were big friends. Professor at Harvard at the age of 21. First American to get a PhD. He got it at the University of Göttingen in Germany. Fluent in French, German, Italian, Latin, ancient Greek. Leader of the Whig Party. Close associate, admirer of Webster for many years. And also somebody who believed just about everything Webster did. This is what Edward Everett said about slavery. Domestic slavery is not, in my judgment, to be set down as an immoral institution. And no abolitionist would ever forget that when Edward Everett was governor, he supported legislation that would effectively muzzle abolitionists and punish them for public statements against slavery. And that's the man who now decided that what Boston needed was a Daniel Webster statue that would communicate Websterian values of leaving that inconvenient issue of slavery aside and going on in order, stability, harmony, money-making into the foreseeable future. So they had the meeting, they all decided, let's have a Webster statue. People there at the meeting, they really thought this could contribute to the need to maintain public order in Boston. It's 1852. It's 1 year after Shadrach Minkins, the fugitive slave, had been freed by a Boston mob, as Everett's friends called it, led by Lewis Hayden. It's a time of increasing Irish immigration. It's a time when these banking interests, these old Brahmin Yankees, really wanted to communicate order and stability to everybody else. So let's have a Webster statue, and let's not put it in the state capitol. Let's not put it inside like Chantry's Washington. Let's have it outside somewhere. Everybody can see it, and that's going to do some real public good. So the only thing to do now was find a sculptor, and that was the easy thing because the fix was in. Everett had a really good friend who was maybe the leading American sculptor in the world, living in Italy, as almost all American sculptors did at the time. And that was this man, that's Hiram Powers. And he would very quickly get the commission for a Webster statue in 1852. He got the letter officially informing him in 1853. Hiram Powers was the son of Vermont. He moved to Ohio at an early age, lived in Cincinnati for a long time, and he decided he was going to be a sculptor because just like Chantry, he just happened to be fiddling around and he found he was pretty good at this. And then somebody hired him to create wax figures of terrifying demons from Dante's Inferno for public display. And he did that in Cincinnati, was very successful at it. Eventually began accomplishing portrait busts, not just in Cincinnati, but eventually in Washington. And in Washington, he met Daniel Webster, and he did a portrait bust of Daniel Webster in the 1830s. So he knew Webster, knew what he looked like, good choice for that reason. Also, Powers by the 1840s was probably the most famous American artist in the world, not just the most famous sculptor, but the most famous American artist of any kind. And the reason was his most famous work. This is what Powers is known for more than anything else to this day. That's the famous Greek slave, which many of you have seen in one context or another by Hiram Powers. And this illustration is not too perhaps finely detailed, but this is a slave. It's a Greek woman who has been taken captive by the Turks during the Greek Wars of Independence. And she has been told to take off her clothes so she can reveal herself to potential Turkish buyers in a slave market. So here she is faced with a lascivious glare of men who now want to buy her and keep her as a slave. But what people admired about this was, despite these humiliating, awful circumstances, she keeps dignity about her. She has poise about her. She maintains her self-respect despite everything. We know she's a Christian. There's a little cross here that you can't see here, but actually does happen on the statue. And for many people in America, when this toured the country in the 1840s, this was the very first nude statue they had ever seen. It was, in fact, the first standing female nude statue ever to tour the United States. And what people were told was, do not think of her as unclad. She is clad. She's clad in her own modesty. She's clad in her own virtue. Reviews were ecstatic. People in Boston lined up and down School Street to pay 25 cents a piece to view this statue when it appeared here, I think, in 1847. And everybody had an opinion on it. Here's one review of the famous Greek slave, and this sums up why so many people liked it. So pure an atmosphere breathes through it that the eye of man beams only with reverent delight, and the cheek of woman glows with the fullness of emotion. So nobody would look at this in a carnal way. Everybody would see this as an uplifting moral lesson of the enduring strength of the human spirit. Everybody, Queen Victoria loved this statue. Here it is, as a matter of fact. This is at the Crystal Palace in London, in the part of the Arts and Industry building reserved to the United States. And it became, for most people, the finest American work of sculpture they had ever seen. And it would have that reputation for many years. Hiram Powers commissioned a tour, as I said, of the statue of the United States. The man who ran the tour was a really, really good organizer of events, and he made a lot of money off it. Not a lot of money went to Powers, but enough so that Powers could invest in the New York Central Railroad. And that earned him a fortune. You never go wrong betting on Cornelius Vanderbilt. That was good advice back then. So Powers did very well off this. And there were many, many miniatures of this sold all around the country. Frederick Douglass had one in his home in Washington, D.C. for many years. And that kept it familiar, and that kept it in the American consciousness. And if you want to see this today, there's a copy at the Corcoran Gallery in Washington, D.C. And there's 4 more of the original copies that are in various places around the world. But it really made Powers' reputation. Not everybody loved it. It is a Greek slave. It's a Christian slave. And many abolitionists wondered, why are you bestowing all your admiration on this? There are real life slaves who demand your attention. And you're oohing and ahhing over this white Christian girl. What about Africans held in slavery? And here's what one abolitionist said: waste not your sympathies on this senseless marvel, but reserve some tears for the helpless humanity which lies quivering beneath the lash of American freemen. I've never been able to say this about anything so far ever since 2006. This is the only thing that I've ever brought up that Elizabeth Barrett Browning wrote a sonnet about. She wrote a sonnet about the Greek slave. So I just want to read one line from it. Elizabeth Barrett Browning on the Greek slave. Appeal, fair stone, from God's pure heights of beauty against man's wrong. Catch up in thy divine face, not alone, griefs east and west. Strike and shame the strong by thunders of white silence, evil overthrown. Now that made him famous all around the world. And he also happened to be a really good friend of Edward Everett. So it's no wonder he got this commission. Now he's going to do a Daniel-Webster statute. The root of the problems that were to follow stem from this, though. Powers was really good at this. This is idealizing beauty, loftiness of spirit. This is the ideal. It's really a gorgeous, wonderful work in many ways. But Daniel Webster was not a lofty, idealistic spirit. The only perfection he ever pursued in his life was the perfect gin cocktail at the Union Oyster House. He was a serial philanderer, drank way too much, never understood genuine moral objections against slavery. He was a temporizer, a compromiser, and there's always a place for that in politics, of course. But maybe somebody good at this sort of thing would not be so good at Daniel Webster. That's the only point I want to make so far. But anyway, Powers got the commission, given his connection with Everett. Everett was really Powers' lobbyist in the United States. Everett spent years trying to get Congress to accept this statute. It's called the Statue of America by Hiram Powers. It's a life-size statue of a woman said to represent America. I'm not sure I see it. What is America doing here? It's been heavily criticized. It's like America is stepping out of the shower to tell her husband you forgot your lunch. No wonder Congress didn't want to buy that. But one thing that's funny about this is Everett really wanted this to be outside the Capitol, along with Brenos, Washington. So he actually sat down with Franklin Pierce, and he tried to describe to Franklin Pierce the spirit of symbolism in the ideal in sculpture. And to me, there are three great works in the 19th century, early 20th century that deserve attention. Three great, wonderful, vast works and challenges. And one was the Panama Canal, one was the Brooklyn Bridge, and the other was trying to explain symbolism in art to Franklin Pierce. And it really seemed to work, and Congress never bought the thing. But at any rate, Powers got to work. He spent 4 years on this statue, way longer than Everett thought was really necessary. But eventually he got done with the statue, and all he's got to do now is send this bronze Daniel Webster statue on the ship to America. It's going to dock in Boston. So he spends all kinds of money. He gets the bronze statue to the ship. Ship leaves Italy, goes into the Atlantic. It's the SS Oxford. Weeks go by and Everett is anxiously awaiting the statue. Where's the statue? Abolitionists know about the statue. They don't like the idea, but there's going to be a controversy, but maybe they'll get used to it. Everett's got high hopes. But then there's a storm and the SS Oxford goes down into the Atlantic along with the Daniel Webster statue. The Oxford's crew were rescued. They were okay. But Daniel Webster was not rescued. He went way down into the Atlantic. There, Everett said, in typical Everett fashion, to adorn those great ocean halls to which first and last so many statues have, since the creation of the world, descended. William Lloyd Garrison had different ideas about this. He was happy to hear that Webster is down below the Atlantic. Here's what William Lloyd Garrison said. Webster is going to be admired by the only people he can really understand, the slaveholders and slave hunters of the sea, the sharks. Actually, Hiram Powers had really bad luck with the Atlantic Ocean. The SS Oxford went down in 1857. 7 years before that, he had sent a statue of John C. Calhoun, which is really elaborate. There it is, a copy of etching of it that you can see there. He had sent that to Charleston. I spent all sorts of time on it. Some marble John C. Calhoun. He was much better at marble than bronze, as we'll see. So Calhoun goes on the ocean. Does anybody recognize the name SS Elizabeth, 1850? So he's held who is on the SS Elizabeth. A smallpox epidemic ravaged the Elizabeth halfway across the Atlantic. People were sick and dying. Captain was down with smallpox. The first mate had to take over the ship. First mate was very confused. A storm came up. The first mate thought they were right by Cape May, New Jersey, but they were actually by Fire Island, off Long Island. Ship went aground. Ship began to sink. Also on board was Margaret Fuller Asoli, the great transcendentalist, author, poet, essayist. She was there with her husband Giovanni and her young child. They tried to get her to get in a lifeboat, but Margaret Fuller Asoli knew that her husband Giovanni couldn't swim. And so she told the people trying to rescue her, I'll stay here with my husband and child, we'll all go down together. And so they did, they all went down together, and that's how she died, 1850. But the John C. Calhoun statue did go down with the Elizabeth. This, however, was resurrected, they salvaged it. They got it over to Charleston, they actually put this up in Charleston, and then Fort Sumter happened, and nobody wanted John C. Calhoun to be hurt if there was going to be a Union attack on Charleston. So they moved it to Columbia, and there, to the best of our knowledge, it was burned when Sherman burned Columbia in February of 1865. So we no longer have that statue in any shape. Now, what was Powers going to do now? The statue is at the bottom of the Atlantic. He wasn't worried about that. He knew there was insurance on the statue. And so he went to work again, produced another bronze Daniel Webster. He knew he was going to get paid. Put that on another ship. Everett now is beside himself. This thing actually got to get here. And it eventually got to Boston. It arrived in the late summer of 1859. And that's when the problems began. Here is Daniel Webster by Hiram Powers. Everett was not in Boston when this statue finally arrived. But the people responsible unboxed it, and they decided they put it on public display at the Boston Athenaeum. And they put it in the vestibule at the Boston Athenaeum for people to see it. By now, they had decided where this thing was going to go. They wanted to put it in front of the old State House, but there's too much traffic there. So they decided to put it on the State House grounds. This would be the very first statue in front of the State House. But before Everett could get there, the decision was made to put it on display so people could see it. In the meantime, at the Athenaeum, and people filed in, they looked at it, and almost nobody liked it. The lighting wasn't very good. It was at a bad angle for display. It got all sorts of bad critical commentary. And I thought maybe before we go any further, the thing to do now is to point out why many people disliked it. Even if they didn't despise Webster, as many abolitionists did. Many people thought this statue just had pretty obvious artistic flaws. And maybe you can point out some of them yourself. But I'd like to begin perhaps with the fasces. So these, of course, are bungled sticks. That's the Roman fasces. And if Edward Everett were here, as he may be here in spirit, what Edward Everett would tell us all is, yes, those are fasces, because ever since the 7th century BC, that has been a symbol of Roman state authority, decreed as such by Lucius Tarquinius Priscus. And for many years, it was a symbol of state authority in Rome. It was carried by lictors who were following consuls in various processions. But beginning in the 2nd century AD, Aesop's fables contained a story involving bundled sticks, a story some of you may have heard, where a father instructs his children, one stick can be broken, but a bundle of sticks put together cannot be broken, they're strong. And so the fasces became a symbol, not just of state authority, but also strength and unity. An appropriate symbol for Daniel Webster, who did not think regional strife amounted to anything, who thought we should all forget about slavery. And in that unity was American strength for Webster. So why not have a symbol of a fasces? That's why Powers has it there. It makes sense from that perspective. But look at these fasces. That's a poor excuse for fasces. Look how thin they are. I think I could break those fasces. It doesn't seem to really make any sense. You want to see really good fasces that really communicate strength, authority, and unity? Go to Benito Mussolini's tomb. No, don't do that. Because fasces gave rise to the term fascism, as we know, which is one reason maybe to avoid them these days. But if you really want to see fasces, you can look at the US dime. They're on the back of the dime. And you could also look at those fasces on the Lincoln Memorial. Those fasces are nice, thick, strong fasces. They communicate strength and union the way fasces are supposed to. See them on the front of the chair. They're all over the Lincoln Memorial. And here's who dons Washington. This is in the rotunda of the Virginia Capitol, one of the most famous statues in America. Look at those fasces. That's real strength. That's real unity. They make sense of those compositions. They really strike you, but not these, I would say. They come across as a bit ridiculous. And Webster is leaning on them, as you see, with his left hand. But in addition to that, I think the fault of this is that Hiram Powers has depicted Webster in a classical pose. You often would see orators depicted this way. Their right hand holds the scroll of what they're about to say. Demosthenes looks a little bit like this in one of the sculptures depicting him. Powers would have known that. And it comes across in this composition as just a little bit awkward. It doesn't really arrest the eye or appeal to the eye. And that's what people thought at the time. And most critics still think so to this day. So I thought what I'd do, because I enjoy them, is to read some critical commentary on the Webster statue, which never really had any major supporters from the day it arrived in Boston. One critic in the Evening Transcript did decide he wanted to say a nice thing about the statue. And this is what he said. The right leg shows signs of study. Another prominent critic in the 19th century, also a sculptor, Lorado Taft, was not willing to even go that far. He said, from afar, it kind of looks like a statue. But as soon as one mounts the State House steps and get close to the thing, according to Taft, he realizes the sculptor's helplessness with the body. Here, the pose becomes absurd, even imbecilic. Surely the great orator could not have looked like this. One of America's earliest art critics, James Jackson Jarvis, thought the statue was just ridiculous because of that pose. It is awkward. According to Jarvis, the statue does serve a purpose. It could certainly terrify birds in a field of corn. But that's about it. And what about these trousers? They seem on the baggy side. Maybe that's a way for Powers to conceal his ignorance of the human anatomy, according to one critic. And the list goes on. Nobody has ever liked it. And even from the time it arrived in Boston, most people who saw it didn't like it, which created a problem for Edward Everett. He finally got back to Boston, and there was a revolt. There was a revolt in the Boston Webster Statue Committee. They were the ones who raised the money. And a lot of them said, let's just forget the whole thing. There's another statue we could put up. And there was another statue they could have put up. And it had just been fashioned by a Bostonian, Thomas Ball. And if you've been to Central Park recently, you've seen it there. This is Thomas Ball's Daniel Webster. And he had done this earlier in the 1850s. This is an old Daniel Webster, the way he appeared in the 1840s and 1850s. It's much more realistic because Thomas Ball was a Bostonian. He hadn't been to Italy yet. He hadn't been under the influence of neoclassical ideals. He just gave us Daniel Webster. So that's Daniel Webster. Maybe that would have been better, maybe a bit more preferable to some people. So there was a big debate, do we take this one or not? And what Everett did was he tried to salvage this. He's got to defend his friend. Powers is his friend. So he got before the Boston Statue Committee and he said, you cannot subject Powers to the indignity of rejecting the commission at this late date after he's done all the work. And somebody in the committee said, how about we have the public decide? We'll have Thomas Ball's statue over here. We'll have Powers work over here. Let the public decide. And what Everett said was, that would be the worst indignity of all. What Everett said was, all the gold in California would not be enough to compensate Powers for the humiliation of subjecting his work to public vote after we had given the commission. And I was said to myself, I think I would take all the gold in California if I were Powers. Why is Everett speaking for Powers on this? But at any rate, Everett had his way. And the committee backed down. Thomas Ball did not get the chance to have his work in the State House grounds instead of Powers' work. And so that work would be put up finally in September of 1859. The Almighty God did everything possible to prevent this. First, the original Webster was sent to the Atlantic. Now this is the second Webster. There was a huge storm on dedication day, so they couldn't actually dedicate this when they wanted to. But even God was not enough to stand in the way of Edward Everett. And so a few days later, they did put the statue up. And to close, here is Edward Everett, despite all the controversy about the artistic merits of the statue, telling us what all this is about. Here's why there is a statue, even though so many abolitionists were calling Webster slavery's dog, and other names not quite so complimentary. So according to Everett, this statue erected here in the State House will assure us all, teach us all, that we have only to leave the mighty problem which now so greatly tasks the prudence and patriotism of the wisest and best in the land to the states. That is slavery. Just leave it to the states and forget about it. All we need to do, Everett said, was follow his example and avoid extreme opinions, that is anti-slavery. Let us cherish harmony and brotherly love between all sectors of the country. His address took up 2 full pages of the New York Times, just went on and on about Daniel Webster, and never once said the word slavery. He just talked about the problem that's facing the country now. Leave it aside, leave it to the states, and all will be well. Well, that's what he said in 1859. Abolitionists, during the speech, some of them were literally heckling him. This is what it looked like when they finally dedicated it. That's, of course, the State House. There's the statue. I'm very close by where that portico is. 10,000 people went to see it. Not all of them clapped, of course. A lot of people disliked it. And abolitionists never got used to it. Many of them said, all through late 1859, was this statue, quote, debases the people. Theodore Parker, the great abolitionist, Theodore Parker said, this is a disgrace to the state, this statue. This is not what we stand for. It is repugnant to the moral values of Massachusetts. It's a dishonor to our state. They tried to get it removed. This is the very first removal statue controversy in the history of New England. Let's remove this. Let's just get out of the Webster business entirely. They weren't successful, and so the statue stays there to this day. And it shows how fruitless the efforts were to somehow direct public opinion in an issue as contentious as slavery by a mere statue. It's September 1859. 1 month later was John Brown's raid, and that set the stage for the war that was to follow. A war that Edward Everett would deplore, and he wouldn't live to see the end of it, as so many others didn't. So these controversies would continue. And in closing, now that we know something about this Webster statue, the very first statue on the State House grounds, and one that I think exemplifies how difficult it can be to justify a statue when one half the community already dislikes everything it stands for. And how maybe important it is not to have big elites making these decisions for us. You certainly feel that way if you're William Lloyd Garrison or Frederick Douglass. Let's now look in closing at a statue that really worked. This is a statue that was commissioned after the Webster statue, but it was put in before the Webster statue. It's the work of the great Richard Saltonstall Breno, Horatio's brother. And it's the first statue after Aristides the Just and Columbus to go up outside of Boston. That's the Benjamin Franklin statue. And Benjamin Franklin, everything Webster isn't. First of all, they wait 60 years after Franklin dies to put up the statue. And second, nobody's going to disagree about Franklin. Everybody loves Franklin. He stood the test of time. He exemplifies something important to Boston: learning, education, invention, technology, still important to this day. And look at the statue. It's a statue that's likable. This has been lost in a private thought that he's something himself. Supposed to be during the peace negotiations, the alliance negotiations in France in 1778. It's a statue that everybody liked all at once. And people take pictures of it to this day on School Street, tourists from around the world. They see Ben Franklin, they want to take pictures of it. This is a statue that does communicate something that makes us happy. A faith in the virtues and the considerable talents of Franklin that Bostonians still consider important to them to this day. Invention, technology, learning. This is the statue that works. It's an integral part of our life, and it stands on the site of the old Boston Latin School where Franklin himself went to school. It makes sense in every possible way. And it stood the test of time, it's very successful, whereas the Webster statute, maybe, in my opinion, we ought to probably think about removing that and maybe putting something up in its place. Or maybe if you like Webster, put up something like that. That communicates the strength. That's Webster. That's in Scott's Circle in Washington, DC. And that's the Webster maybe after the Civil War, when the memories of 1850 have faded. Maybe that's the Webster we should remember and commemorate. The strength of his oratory and the power to move people, his charisma, but it's not the Webster we have. Well, there are many stories, controversies like that, and I'll share some more of them as the weeks go on. But that might be a good place to end because I've kept you sitting there for an hour. So anything I can do for you? Any questions or comments? Yes, go
Is
ahead.
the original Webster that went down in the ocean still at the bottom of the ocean?
Entertain the sharks.
Okay.
Yeah, he's still down there. Yeah, they never did anything about the Oxford. Yeah,
So we know it's the same or
it's
is that-
exactly the same. Yeah, because
all of them have baggy pants.
yeah. Oh, yeah, that's a good point. Actually, Everett had to defend the baggy pants. He said, actually, Webster actually did have baggy pants. So, he actually said that in his speech. Yeah. Yeah, go ahead.
As far as the artistic discussions, you talk about like the togas and whatnot.
Yeah.
Were sculptors given carte blanche at that time, or would they present some sort of a plan to say, here's what it's gonna look like?
They were sometimes told no toga. In fact, Richard Salterstone Breno in the Franklin statue was encouraged not to have a toga. In fact, what they did was they gave him an minister of the Mass Historical Society, where they actually had Franklin's coat that he wore in Paris during the alliance negotiations to model it on this, which is a wise thing to do. But if they didn't give instructions like that, sculptors, sometimes as a matter of course, until after the Civil War, would drape these figures in togas. And I'm going to give you some more unfortunate examples of that as the weeks go on. That hasn't stood the test of time very well. A lot of sculptors prefer the toga because if you want to do a sculpture of a modern dressed person, trousers, it's a little bit awkward to do it. It's not that easy to do, but the draperies of a toga they were used to is relatively simple. So they would prefer the toga. It also exemplifies classical virtue, but maybe not so well to a 19th century audience. That's the problem. Yes.
But would sometimes a statue show up and it would be a total surprise as to how it looked? Would
Yeah.
they say, oh my gosh, we paid for this?
Well, they would want to avoid that. Usually that wouldn't happen. Usually what would happen is they talk to the sculptor. The sculptor would give them a general idea of what they want to do. And sometimes the sculptor would share this preliminary sketch. And on the basis of the sketch, they would award the commission. But sometimes it was sight unseen. The Webster statue was sight unseen because Everett knew power so well. But mostly they had a bit more to go on. So they would know that if they didn't want to toga, if the sketch showed a toga, they could say, this isn't what we want. I'll go back to the drawing board. But it was always these committees that made the decision. It was never the city of Boston. There's always committees of private people who decided what they wanted, raised the money, and then offered it to Boston, usually in the confidence that it would be accepted. We have a Hamilton statue in the Back Bay only because one person wanted a Hamilton statue. That's the only reason it's there. And that was true for many years in our history. What is the topic for next week? I think I said what it was going to be.
I have to look it up.
Okay.
We'll come anyway.
I'm very glad to see all of you here. And I hope you come back next time. I really enjoy talking about these things. So, thank you.